All right, welcome back. What's the difference between a subroutine and a function? They're pretty minor, but it's an important thing to know the difference of. So we've been working with this chunk of code for a while now. It's getting a bit long. We're just going to get rid of it for now. I know it's scary to get rid of this code. The temptation to comment out code is very strong when you begin. You don't want to lose any of this precious code. I'll tell you one thing that is just a fundamental truth. No code is truly all that great. If you wrote it once, you can write it better a second time. So it's not like this is worth the effort. Just forget it. If you want to see it, go back to the previous videos. Otherwise, we're starting fresh. So we need to lay down some fundamentals first. So we're gonna make something called a subroutine, my subroutine, and we're gonna do my function. So the difference between a subroutine and a function seems minute, but it's actually pretty important. A subroutine is just a chunk of code. Like I said before, it's a chunk of code, a reusable chunk of code. Whereas a function actually it's the same thing, but it's a reusable chunk of code that takes in input and puts out output, whatever. So what does that mean? So it obviously takes in a parameter, but it has to do something, and once it does something, it has to return it, and that's the magic word, return. So what could this return? So let's say oh, actually here's a good example. So this function is going to take in a string, but then we're going to also take in a number. So these two parameters are now part of the thing. I'm gonna let's see. I'm gonna give this a. I'm gonna give it let me call it word. So just to give it clear naming conventions. So what I want to do with my function is it takes in a word and it takes in a number. What this reusable chunk of code should do is then return something. In this case, I'm going to return some concatenation. As you remember, concatenation is just adding strings together. So word plus, and remember we got to put that space in there, plus number. So what does this do? Well, let's see. Gee, it does nothing. Why does it do nothing? Because we don't ever call it. So now we have these two completely separate chunks of code that we can now use anywhere we want in the rest of the application. So I'm just gonna put that little separator in to kind of define that invisible boundary. So we'll actually, here just for kicks, we'll call this this is purely aesthetic. So these are my functions section, or we'll call them methods. That's a more generic term for the same things. Functions and subroutines fall under the term methods. These are methods that you use to do stuff. So as an example, we can call my subroutine, and what happens? Oh, it breaks. Why does it break? Because we're missing string on line 15. So we go to line 15 and we're like, oh yeah, that's string that we had to submit to it. So again, hello world. And we run it, and now we've got a working subroutine. So now let's start getting into what we call nested logic. Why is any of this useful? How do we use it together? Because so far all we've been doing is writing these little minute statements and executing them, and that's it. That doesn't really add up to anything unless you know how to put it all together. So now we're going to start injecting code into code, and this is where the real power begins, because now you start to see how little bits of code, little subroutines, start to become little components or tiny little virtual machines. So we have this subroutine, but we want to be able to use this function too. So this function does nothing but return these two parameters concatenated together with a space in the middle. So all of a sudden I can do something kind of interesting. I can use these, and again, thank God for IntelliSense, we can actually see what we can put in here. So we can put a word, so we'll use a string right here, hello, and we'll put a number, and that number will be 1. So what's going to happen? What do you think is going to print out? Hopefully you've been able to interpret all this. This subroutine is going to fire this print statement. This print statement is going to print out this this variable str. Well, let me change the name of that just for. It's going to print this line of code. Print this value. That's even better. So it's going to print this value. Now this value that I'm feeding into it is actually going to access this function, and this function is going to actually take in two parameters and concatenate them together. So really what we're doing is we're taking hello and 1 and combining them into a single string, returning that string, and injecting that string into the parameter section of the subroutine. So what we should get is hello space 1. And we didn't. Why? Because you cannot concatenate a string to a blah 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 blah. It's that, like I said, the confusing errors. But after a little while, you begin to read between the lines. What it's saying is you can't concatenate a number, an integer, to a word. Actually, what you need to use is another function called, and this is why I changed the name, str. So str creates a new string object, blah blah blah. Basically, it converts whatever you stick into that function into a string. So now it's going to take this number and turn it into, rather than it being the value of 1, it's going to turn it into the value of 1. And you see the difference. The difference is this isn't a number. It's just a character that looks like a number to human beings. To the computer, it's a string. This number is the same as this. This is the same as this. Is the same as this. It's using the same amount of memory, which is the reason we have data types, is we know how much memory to actually delegate to a variable. This is not important in most modern programming languages because behind the scenes the computers handle all the memory allocation. It used to be very important. It's not that important to know this stuff anymore. It's important to understand it, but you don't have to maintain it actively while you're programming. So let's try this again. Again, the fix I made is I'm converting this integer value into a string and then concatenating this string to this string to this string. So hopefully that fixes it. And we got it. Hello 1. Amazing. Next thing, we're going to actually start using a for loop to enhance this further.